Welcome, my friends. Today is day 19, endurance plus mental toughness. This is where you prove you don't break. Starting with your endurance warm-up, jumping jacks, 1 minute, steady pace.
Lost in my cut over this music, Baba look and make way. This girl no one miss our everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me.
And 1 minute, perfect. Next, 50 bodyweight squats.
Pick my call, make I no cry. I don't call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, arrest. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing holy to the heavenly. Trying to mistake away from me. No one trying to stop my melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover me from bad energy draining me. Baba loke and sound. Baba loke and sound. Pick my call, make I no cry. I don't call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, arrest. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Bye bye, poverty, arrest. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. These strings on the beat. Yo, TABLIZ God, now the building. Baba loke and sound. Baba loke and sound. Pick my call, make I no cry. I don't call, make you call back.
Okay, next, 12 burpees.
Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, arrest. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Lost in my cut over this music, Baba look and make way. This girl no one miss our everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me. Baba look and sound. Baba look and sound. Pick my call, make I no cry. I don't call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen.
Okay, next, 35 push-ups. I'm using a booty band, and you can drop your knees for easier movement.
Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing holy to the heavenly. Trying to mistake away from me. No one trying to stop my melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover
Okay, next 50 pulse squats. Okay, next 1 minute mountain climbers.
Lost in my cut over this music, Baba look and make way. This girl no one miss away. Everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer.
Okay, next 2 minutes 40 seconds forearm plank. Perfect. Next 2 minutes 40 seconds glute bridge hold. Lost in my cut over this music, Baba look and make way. This girl no one miss away. Everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make I no cry. I don't call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. No need for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen.
man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing holy, holy to the heavenly. Trying to mistake away from me. No one trying to stop my melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover me from bad energy draining me. Babaloke and sound, Babaloke and sound. Pick my call, make I know by you. I don't the call, make you call back. Oh. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest.
Okay, next, reverse lunge, 20 on each side.
Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. These strings on the beat. Yo, TABLIZ girl, now the building. Babaloke and sound, Babaloke and sound. Pick my call, make I know by you. I don't the call, make you call back. Oh. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Lost in my thought over this. Music, Baba look and make way. This girl know I miss her. Everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me. Baba look and sound. Baba look and sound. Pick my call, make I know by you. I don't the call, make you call back. Oh. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen.
Okay, next, 1 minute 40 seconds side plank on each side.
Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing holy, holy to the heavenly. Trying to mistake away from me. No one trying to stop my melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover me from bad energy draining me. Babaloke and sound, Babaloke and sound. Pick my call, make I know by you. I don't the call, make you call back. Oh. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. These strings on the beat.
Okay, switch sides.
Babaloke and sound, Babaloke and sound. Pick my call, make I know by you. I don't the call, make you call back. Oh. Blessings upon blessings, amen. Money for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. that, like a this. Lost in my thought over this. Music, Baba look and make way. This girl know I miss her. Everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make a no cry. I don't they call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. No need for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing only to the heavenly. Trying to miss the
Okay, now 60 Russian twist.
melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover me from bad energy draining me. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make a no cry. I don't they call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. No need for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen.
Okay, next mental finisher. Wall sit for 2 minutes. Mind over body.
Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. These strings on the beat. Yo, TABLIZ girl, now the building. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make a no cry. I don't they call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. No need for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Lost in my thought over this. Music, Baba look and make way. This girl know I miss her. Everybody belly away. Shine bright like a diamond, I pray. On my knees, I feel the pain. From the sunny to the raining days. Let the heavens answer me. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make a no cry. I don't they call, make you call back. Blessings upon blessings, amen. No need for the spending, amen. This music go pay me, amen. Amen, amen, amen. 1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas.
Okay, now let's finish up with a deep stretch, pigeon, 45 seconds on each side.
Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. I sing only to the heavenly. Trying to mistake away from me. No one trying to stop my melody. This music is all of me. This music is all of me. The struggle so real is it's in me. I pray to God to cover me from bad energy draining me. Baba look answer. Baba look answer. Pick my call, make a no cry.
Great. Tuck your back toes, lift your glutes up, press into your palm, stretch your right IT bend. Breathe in and out. Great. Step back and switch to the other side. Perfect.
1 million, 2 million, amen. We go fly overseas, amen. Amen, amen, amen. Amen. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. Edge just to cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Bye bye, poverty, RS. Win a man, I win conquest. cover me, don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. These strings on the beat.
Yo, TABLIZ girl, now the building.
Babaloke and south, Babaloke and south. Pick my call, make I no cry.
Okay, now tuck your back toes, press into your palm, lift your glutes, stretch out your left IT band. Beautiful. Breathe in and out into that area. Step back, chaturanga, upward facing dog. Breathe in and sit back to child pose. So we have come to the end of today's workout. Day 19 done. 2 days left. See you tomorrow, day 20. It's Answer playing us out.
Don't test. Like a this, like a that, like a this. Lost in my cut over this.